Welcome back to LoreFactsTV. I'm Morlocks, and I want to start with a simple question that's been sitting in the back of my mind ever since Deltarune's story started to take shape. What if the weirdest thing about Deltarune isn't the night, or the bunker, or even whatever Chris is doing when we aren't allowed to look? What if the weirdest thing is the way the game is paced? The way it parcels itself out into chapters, teaches you to treat them like neat little episodes, and then starts tearing holes in that comfort. I figure the community treated like an endgame threat storms onto the screen at the end of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 follows that up with something quieter but arguably even more unsettling. Chris is coordinating with someone off-screen, someone we only hear on the phone, and that secrecy isn't aimed only at us. Susie and Rouse are also being kept out of the loop. So today, I want to zoom out. Instead of trying to solve Deltarune's mysteries head-on, we're going to look at the story's shape. We're going to treat Deltarune like a narrative that knows exactly where it's going, even if it refuses to tell us directly. And we'll use a classical tool to do that, the 3-act story structure. Setup, confrontation, resolution. Not as a rigid formula, and definitely not as a way to force the game into a box, but as a way to describe what the story seems to be doing, and what it still needs to do if it wants to land cleanly. And by the end, I'm going to propose a theory about what the remaining chapters might look like structurally. That includes a speculative but grounded idea that Deltarune could eventually include an extra Chapter 0, released later and placed narratively between Chapters 6 and 7, because it might actually solve a very specific structural problem that the story is clearly building toward. So let's start at the beginning. What does 3-act story structure actually mean when you're applying it to a game like this? And what does Deltarune look like when you stop asking what happens next and start asking what the story still owes you? Before we say anything meaningful about where Deltarune might be going, we need a way to talk about shape. What I mean by that is the larger question of how the story seems to be moving over time. That's where the 3-act story structure comes useful, as long as we treat it correctly. 3-act structures are more than just a rulebook, and it isn't a test that a story has to pass or fail. It's a descriptive tool, a way of naming patterns that show up again and again in how stories tend to unfold. When it fits, it can help explain pacing, escalation, and why certain moments feel like turning points even when nothing obvious explodes on screen. When it doesn't fit cleanly, that friction can tell us something important about what the story is trying to do differently. At its most basic level, a 3-act story breaks down into setup, confrontation, and resolution. Act 1 usually establishes the normal world, introduces the characters, and presents a problem that disrupts that normal. There's usually a moment where the story commits, where return to the starting point is no longer an option. Act 2, however, is the longest stretch. This is where the central conflict deepens, complications stack, and the story tests its ideas through pressure. Stakes rise, information changes how earlier events are understood, and the characters are forced to respond rather than to drift. Act 3 is where everything converges. The story stops expanding and starts resolving. Conflicts collide, choices matter, and the narrative has to live with the consequences of what it set in motion. A helpful way to visualize this is as a gradual climb and descent. Act 1 is the uphill ramp that gets the story moving. Act 2 is the long descent, full of obstacles and detours where the real weight of the journey is felt. But Act 3 is the final stretch, where the path narrows, the destination comes into view, and the story commits to an ending rather than just more possibilities. What's important here is that good stories rarely follow this shape in an obvious or mechanical way. Inciting incidents can be quiet, midpoints can be emotional rather than explosive, a story can feel playful on the surface while still tightening its structure underneath. 3-act story structures describe tendencies, not actual obligations that the story has to commit to. That distinction matters a lot for Deltarune. Toby Fox's writing is openly playful and often very self-aware. The game toys with genre conventions, talks directly to the player, and constantly reminds you that you're inside something artificial. But subversion like that only works if the underlying structure exists in the first place. You can't meaningfully twist expectations unless there's something solid to twist against. Deltarune doesn't reject structure, right? It doesn't do something completely different, it decides to hide it instead. It bends it, and it kind of occasionally makes a joke out of it. There's also the implication that Deltarune is unfinished and episodic. We're looking at a story mid-construction, with entire sections still missing. That means we can't treat any structural reading as definitive. What we can do, however, is look at emphasis. Where does the game spend its time? What ideas does it introduce early on and keeps returning to? Where do tonal shifts begin to appear? Structure in this context becomes a way of asking better questions instead of just declaring answers. One especially useful insight from 3-act thinking is how it reframes the middle of the story. Act 2 isn't just the part where things happen, it's where the story teaches you what kind of story it actually is. The setup shows you the pieces. The middle shows you how those pieces behave under strain. For Deltarune, that's a crucial distinction, because the game is deeply concerned with the idea of story itself. It has prophecies, chapters, narrators, save files, and menus that behave like characters. It insists there's only one ending, while also suggesting that something else matters more than just reaching it. Those words even come from the mouth of Toby Fox himself. How many endings are there? One. Then doesn't that mean nothing I do matters? There's something more important than reaching the end. So as we move forward, the goal isn't to force Deltarune into a neat 3-act box. The goal is to see where the framework clarifies what the game is already doing, where it resists clean interpretation, and what that tension might be telling us about the road ahead. If the early chapters feel light, playful, and exploratory, the question isn't whether that's just setup. The question is what kind of story needs that kind of beginning, and what kind of ending would make it feel intentional in hindsight. In the next section, we'll start applying this lens to Deltarune as it exists right now. We'll look at how the opening chapters function structurally, what they establish beyond the obvious premise, and why their tone and pacing matters more than they might initially seem. If Act 1 is where a story teaches you how to read it, then Deltarune's first 2 chapters are doing that teaching in a very deceptively gentle way. They introduce a format that looks episodic, bright, and self-contained, while quietly placing pressure points that only matter later. The game spends a lot of time letting you get comfortable. It also slips in small moments that should make comfort feel provisional. Chapter 1 opens in an ordinary rhythm. Chris's morning, the walk to school, the classroom, the errand with Susie, nothing is pitched as mythic. The game doesn't rush to declare or show off its stakes. Instead, it uses the familiar to establish a baseline. What hometown feels like, what these characters feel like in their normal environment, and how the tone handles the awkwardness, loneliness, and routine. That matters because in a 3-act framework, setup is not only about world building, setup is about contrast. The more specific the normal is, the more meaning the disruption can carry. The disruption, when it comes, is clean and sudden. Chris and Susie fall into the dark world, and the story doesn't waste time on prolonged refusal or denial in that moment. They don't sit at the threshold for long. They move. Ralse appears with an explanation ready. A prophecy is offered early, and it's offered with a calm assurance of something the game expects you to accept for now. That's a classic Act 1 move, establish a premise quickly so the story can spend its time showcasing how the characters react to it. This is also where the meta layer starts to feel real in the mechanical sense. The save point does not appear until the Dark World, which is obviously an important detail. The game doesn't fully reveal its familiar RPG infrastructure in the Light World, at least not in that direct, usable form. It waits until the moment the story crosses into fantasy space. Structurally, that ties to the idea of saving, persistence, and replay to the Dark World experience. The Dark World is where rules become visible. It's where the game starts training you in what kind of choices exist, what consequences look like, and how much control you actually have. If you want to talk about Deltarune's structure, you have to pay attention to where that training begins. Chapter 1's main conflict is also structured like a setup chapter. The obstacles are real, but they're manageable. The party forms quickly. Susie's initial refusal takes the form of antagonism and misbehavior, but the chapter is already bending toward reconciliation long before the final boss. By the time the king confrontation happens, the emotional direction is already basically set. The resolution seals the fountain, returns the characters to the light world, and gives the audience that satisfying feeling of closure. Then the game complicates that closure in a very specific way. At the end, the characters do pause and question what happened. There's a moment where the story allows uncertainty back in, asking whether the Dark World was real or a shared experience or something hard to categorize. That beat is easy to overlook because it comes after the adventure has already ended. but structurally, it's doing exactly what Act 1 endings often do. It restores a sense of normal, then inserts a very small crack into it. And the crack is the point. It's the story saying, you can treat this like an after-school adventure if you want, but you shouldn't get too comfortable with that framing. Chapter 2 builds on this by expanding the pattern rather than breaking it. The premise becomes repeatable. Another dark world opens. This time it's a different space with a different flavor. And the story treats that as a continuation rather than a one-time miracle. That's a big Act 1 function, turning an anomaly into a format. It's no longer, oh, this happened once. It's, oh, this is just gonna keep happening. The cyber world is louder, broader, and more crowded, but the structural role is similar. It introduces new recurring characters, new relationship dynamics, and new ways for the game's themes to express themselves. Queen, in particular, works well as an early phase antagonist because her control is framed as helpful. Her world runs on capture, persuasion, comfort, and optimization. She wants people to be happy, and she wants to decide what happiness looks like. In Act 1 terms, that's a problem presented in an approachable shape. It's conflict that has a smile on it. It lets the story explore questions about agency and coercion without immediately declaring itself apocalyptic. Chapter 2 also sharpens the story's interest in the gap between player intent and character experience. Even on the standard path, it's clear the game is thinking about how choices operate inside a system that has limits. And then, in the space of the weird route, the game demonstrates how quickly that system can become cruel. Whether someone treats that route as central text or an optional extremity, it still functions as a structural signal. It shows that the story's mechanics can be made to express something harsher than the default tone suggests. It plants the idea that the fun surface is not a guarantee. The chapter ends on a note that feels less contained than Chapter 1. It doesn't undo the formula exactly, but it strains it. A new fountain appears. The boundary between light world and dark world feels thinner. Chris's final actions push against the player's assumption about who is steering. And again, the story doesn't fully unpack that before cutting away. That too is Act 1 behavior. Setup doesn't answer the biggest question, it just positions them so that later arcs can actually squeeze on them. So taken together, Chapter 1 and 2 read like a fully complete opening act for the overall narrative. Not two self-contained arcs that simply happen to come first. They establish the game's format, introduce the main thematic pressure points, and make the repetition of Dark Worlds feel normal enough they can later feel dangerous. They end with uncertainty placed very carefully at the edges, right where a viewer might be tempted to relax. A clean act break is rarely about scale. People tend to imagine it as a bigger boss, a darker chapter, a louder twist, but in reality, the most meaningful act breaks are conceptual. They change what the story is. They shift the audience from learning about the rules to worrying about who's actually enforcing them. If we're applying a 3-act lens to Deltarune with chapters 1 through 4 in mind, then the end of chapter 3 makes a strong candidate for that shift, because it marks the moment where the story stops letting the central mystery remain a silhouette. Chapters 1 and 2, taken together, establish a rhythm. There's a light world baseline, a dark world incursion, and a contained adventure, boom, a return. That rhythm doesn't make the story shallow, it just makes it legible. It gives the player a sense of how the narrative wants to move. It also gives the game room to smuggle in larger concerns, like the tension between player intention and character autonomy, without forcing a full confrontation just yet. Even when the ending of Chapter 2 strains the container still exists. The game is still operating in chapter units, and the mystery of the night sits outside those units like an organizing threat. That's why the reveal at the end of Chapter 3 matters, not because it answers everything, but because it changes the kind of question we're asking. A hidden antagonist functions differently from a known one. When the night is only an idea, the story's energy sits in speculation. Players can treat each chapter as just another clue board. The moment the night becomes materially present, the story starts to reorient itself around pursuit, consequence, and response. It stops about being whether the central force exists. It becomes about what that force has been doing, what it wants, and what it means that the protagonists have been moving inside a system shaped by it. That reorientation is one of the most common signatures of Act 1 to Act 2 transitions. Act 1 often ends when the story finishes teaching you the premise and then introduces the first piece of information that makes the premise feel dangerous to misunderstand. It's the point where early comfort gets reclassified as vulnerability. The reveal does that. It retroactively makes the earlier chapters feel less like isolated adventures and more like a guided path, whether the guidance came from fate, design, manipulation, or a blend of all three. It also aligns neatly with what Act 1 usually does thematically. Act 1 asks, what is the world, who are these people, and what are the rules of engagement? Deltarune's early chapters do exactly that, and they do it with a tone that encourages you to settle in. Act 2 asks, what do these rules cost, and who benefits from them? That's the kind of question that naturally follows a night reveal. It suggests authorship, it suggests intention behind the pattern, and it creates a reason for the characters and the player to stop treating Dark Worlds as discrete fun episodes that can be solved one at a time. Once you accept that shift, Chapter 4 can be read less as the next adventure and more like an early Act 2 consolidation. This is often what the first stretch of a second act feels like. The story is still using the established format because it has to, but it's now using it under new conditions. The audience is watching the same machinery operate with the awareness that someone is choosing when the machine turns on. And that awareness is pressure. It changes how every familiar beat reads. The return to the light world carries way more suspicion. The idea of sealing a fountain carries more ambiguity. Even small moments of comedy can feel like a deliberate mask rather than a default tone, because the story has now earned the right to be distrusted. This is also the point where the Weird Rat starts to function differently in the overall architecture. In Act 1, it reads like a boundary test, a way of demonstrating that the system can be coerced. After an act break, that knowledge becomes an ongoing shadow. The question stops being, can this happen? And more, it becomes a, what does it mean that this can happen? Especially once the narrative is openly concerned with agents who manipulate events from outside the protagonist's awareness. You don't have to treat the Weird Rat as a required path for it to matter structurally. Its mere existence changes the emotional math of future choices. It trains the player to notice the difference between what the game allows and what the characters want. That theme fits perfectly with an Act 2 that is likely to tighten around control and authorship. So, if we place the act break at the end of Chapter 3, the overall shape begins to look less speculative and more like a coherent design. Act 1 becomes Chapters 1 through 3, not because Chapter 3 feels like a gentle chapter, but because it ends by closing the learning phase and opening the confrontation phase. Then Chapter 4 becomes the early climb of Act 2, where the narrative starts proving that the new information really does change things, rather than treating it as just a cliffhanger. When the night finally appears at the end of Chapter 3, the moment doesn't feel like a reveal in the traditional sense. It feels like an interruption. Up to that point, the story has trained the player to expect escalation to arrive on a specific schedule. Antagonists are introduced, explored, fought, and then resolved within a chapter-sized container. Even when something feels off, the story has usually allowed the player to finish the loop. The night refuses that plan. It refuses that rhythm. What makes the scene work structurally is how abruptly it collapses distance. For 2 chapters, the night has existed as a vague organizing concept, a name, a role, something spoken about in fragments, framed as important but far and remote. The community expectation naturally drifted towards endgame thinking. This was the figure you'd confront when the story was ready to close, not someone who would simply storm into the middle of the chapter and just start swinging. Instead, the night enters without ceremony. They don't arrive as a mystery to be solved or a villain to monologue. They just arrive as a force. The attack on Tenna is sudden and overwhelming, and the ensuing fight is not designed to be won in any conventional sense. Managing to survive and beat the night is quite literally the secret boss of the chapter. That design choice matters. The game is not asking the player to overcome the night like a normal chapter boss. It's asking the player to feel how far out of depth they really are. This is exactly the kind of moment that often marks an act transition in classical structure. Act 1 ends not when the heroes lose everything, but when they realize how unprepared they really are. The knight's entrance recontextualizes the entire opening stretch of the game. The Dark World stops feeling like isolated problems. The chapter format stops feeling like a safety net. The idea that the protagonists are gradually building towards something on their own terms collapses under the weight of a presence that was already moving. Importantly, this moment does not resolve anything. The knight doesn't explain themselves. Their goals remain opaque. The story doesn't even give the player the satisfaction of a clear loss or victory. It gives them a disruption. Structurally, that's what Act 2 needs. It needs a reason for the story to stop feeling exploratory and start feeling pursued. The night doesn't only threaten the characters, they threaten the structure the characters have been living inside. Dark worlds are no longer fun and games. This also explains why placing the act break here makes more sense than pushing it later. If the night had remained distant until the final chapters, then the middle of the story would risk feeling like extended stalling. By introducing the endgame-shaped threat early, the narrative creates forward pressure. Every subsequent chapter now exists in the shadow of that encounter. The audience knows the ceiling. They've seen the scale of power they're dealing with. Act 2 can now be about navigating a story where the ultimate danger is no longer hypothetical. There's another important consequence of the scene. It reframes the player's relationship to expectation. The knight behaves like a character who does not care about narrative pacing. They don't wait their turn. They don't respect chapter boundaries. That behavior mirrors one of Deltarune's recurring concerns. The idea that structure itself can be a tool of control. By breaking the expected order of reveals, the story asserts that its default forces are not beholden to the format that the player has grown comfortable with. That reframing carries directly into Chapter 4 and beyond. After the knight's appearance, the question is no longer what is the next dark world like. It becomes how long can the story pretend things are normal? Act 2 thrives on that tension. It lets the characters continue forward while denying the audience the comfort of believing forward motion equals progress. Each chapter can still function. Each adventure can still resolve locally. But the sense of inevitability has shifted. The story has shown its hand just enough to make delay feel meaningful rather than leisurely. This is also where the Weird Rat's structural role becomes sharper. Earlier, it demonstrated that systems could be abused. After the knight's entrance, that idea sits beside a new one. Someone else may already be abusing the system at a scale the player can't match. Control and authorship stop being this abstract and theoretical ideas, but now they're real. The middle act can now explore those ideas through friction rather than just plain implication. So if we step back and look at the macro shape, chapters 1 through 3 form a complete opening movement. They introduce the rules, normalize the format, and then deliberately break the illusion of safety by revealing a force that does not play by those rules. That is textbook act transition, even if the presentation is loud, sudden, and unsettling rather than just clear and declarative. In the next section, I want to look at Chapter 4 as an early Act 2 material. Not just what happens in it, but how it behaves differently from the earlier chapters, and how that behavior helps us estimate where the true midpoint of Deltarune's overall 7-chapter arc might fall. That midpoint is going to be critical for understanding the later theory about Chapter 0, because 3-act stories tend to do their strangest, most revealing work right there in the middle.
Once the knight has entered the story, Act 2 stops being a hypothetical phase and starts becoming something the narrative actively inhabits. This is where Chapter 4 becomes important, not because it escalates in the same explosive way, but because it demonstrates how the story behaves after its sense of safety has already been compromised. Early Act 2 rarely announces itself with constant spectacle. More often, it reveals itself through pressure, repetition, and a subtle tightening of options. One of the defining traits of a second act is that the story continues to use familiar structures while slowly draining them of comfort. That is exactly what happens here. The chapter format still exists, dark worlds still appear, conflicts still have beginnings and ends. But the emotional context surrounding those beats has shifted. After the knight's intrusion, every return to routine feels provisional. The player has seen the scale of what is moving behind the scenes, and that knowledge lingers even when the chapter itself is quieter or more playful on the surface. This is a common rhythm in 3-act stories. The first stretch of Act 2 often feels deceptively stable. The audience knows something is wrong, but the characters are still functioning normally. They're adapting rather than collapsing. That adaptation is the point. Act 2 is about watching characters continue forward inside a situation that no longer makes sense the way it used to. In Deltarune's case, the question is no longer whether dark worlds can be sealed, but whether sealing them actually addresses the larger problem that has revealed itself. Chapter 4's role, then, is consolidation. It takes information revealed at the act break and lets it settle. This is structurally important, obviously. A midpoint cannot land cleanly unless the story has time to absorb its own revelations. Act 2 needs space to stretch, to explore implications, and to let the audience feel the weight of what they now know. Another key feature of early Act 2 is convergence without payoff. Threads introduced earlier begin to overlap, but they don't resolve just yet. Player control, character autonomy, prophecy, and authorship are no longer just parallel ideas, they're starting to press against each other. Chris's role feels increasingly ambiguous. The chapter format feels increasingly suspicious. The idea that someone else is shaping events is no longer theoretical, but the story resists that urge to explain it, and that restraint is deliberate. Act 2 thrives on incomplete information because it keeps the narrative moving forward under tension rather than just closure. This is also where the Weird Rat's presence changes flavor again. Earlier it functioned as a boundary case, something that revealed how far the system could be pushed. But in early Act 2 it becomes part of the story's negative space. Even when the player is not engaging with it, its existence reframes what choice means. The question shifts from what will happen if I do this to what am I allowed to do at all and who decides that? That question aligns cleanly with a middle act concerned with control and constraint. All of this points towards the importance of the midpoint still to come. In a 7-chapter arc, a structurally significant midpoint would likely fall somewhere around chapter 4 or 5, depending on how much weight the final act carries. Midpoints are often misunderstood as moments of escalation, but more accurately, they're actually moments of redefinition. They change the story's trajectory without ending it. After the midpoint, the story's direction is completely locked. Characters may still hesitate, but the narrative no longer can. For Deltarune, that suggests a midpoint that does more than simply raise the stakes, but reframes purpose, something that forces the story to confront what the Dark Worlds actually are in relation to the Light World, or what the player's role actually is in relation to Chris, or what one ending actually means as a promise rather than a threat. The story has already shown that it's willing to reveal endgame-shaped elements early. That makes it more likely that the midpoint will feel strange, destabilizing, and interpretive rather than actually conclusive. This is where 3-act thinking becomes especially valuable. It encourages patience, and it reminds us that the middle of a story is supposed to feel unresolved, heavy, and slightly directionless. That sensation is the condition that allows a final act to feel inevitable rather than arbitrary. By the end of chapter 4, Deltarune has clearly shifted from introduction into arrangement. The story is no longer focused on teaching the audience how its world works, and it's just focused on moving those pieces into positions that will matter later, even if their exact purpose is still obscured. This is classic Act 2 behavior, and it's where the shape of the finale starts to become visible. Not through answers, but through obvious alignments. One of the most important developments in Chapter 4 is a confirmation that Chris is acting with intent that excludes both the player and the rest of the party. This is not framed as a sudden betrayal or a dramatic reveal, it's quieter than that. We learn that Chris is coordinating with someone unseen, someone we only hear through a phone call. This person facilitates access to the bunker. Information is withheld deliberately. Susie and Rouse are kept in the dark. The player is also kept in the dark. The secrecy is not treated as a misunderstanding that will be cleared up in the next scene. Structurally, this matters more than any single plot detail. Act 2 is where stories often fracture trust, not just between characters, but between the audience and the narrative itself. Up to this point, Deltarune has allowed the player to feel like an observer with partial influence. Even when control felt strained, the game still mostly let the player see what was happening. Chapter 4 introduces a different dynamic. Things are now happening off-screen, coordinated in spaces that the player is just straight up not allowed to access, for reasons the story is not yet ready to explain. This is how convergence begins, by making it clear that separate threads are no longer separate. Chris's autonomy, the player's limited control, the Knight's disruption, the existence of hidden spaces like the bunker, and the presence of an unseen collaborator all point toward the same question. Who is actually shaping the path of the story, and who's just merely moving inside of it? Late Act 2 often feels like this. The narrative stops expanding outwards and starts folding inwards. New mysteries still appear, but they feel connected to existing ones rather than just branching away. The phone call doesn't introduce a brand new theme, it sharpens existing ones. Control, knowledge, exclusion, the tension between what the player wants to know and what the story is willing to show. It's also significant that Susie and Rouse are explicitly excluded alongside the player. This is not a case where the protagonist knows something and the audience is simply waiting to catch up. The party itself is fractured in terms of information. That fracture is likely intentional groundwork for Act 3, because final acts depend on confrontation, and confrontation requires asymmetry. Someone has to know more than someone else. Someone has to have been making choices earlier that only become visible later. In a 3-act framework, this stage of the story is doing a very specific job. It's removing the audience's ability to mentally organize events as episodic. Chapters can still be played one at a time, but they no longer feel self-contained. The story has made itself clear that actions are being taken with long-term intent beyond the scope of any single chapter. That's what prepares a narrative for the final act. Act 3 doesn't work if everything important happens on screen at the last moment. It only works when the audiences realize that the ending has been under construction for a long time. This also helps explain why Deltarune is so careful about what it does not show. The bunker, the voice on the phone, the exact nature of Chris's plan, all of those are withheld not to frustrate the player, but to preserve structural weight. If Act 3 is going to be about collision, then Act 2 needs to quietly align trajectories. Chapter 4 feels like a chapter that exists almost entirely for that purpose. It doesn't resolve earlier tensions, it just organizes them. At this point, the overall arc begins to suggest a very deliberate distribution of narrative labor. Act 1 establishes the format and lulls the audience into trusting it. The end of Chapter 3 then breaks that trust by revealing a force that ignores that format entirely. Chapter 4 then deepens the break by showing that even the protagonist is no longer operating transparently within the system that the player understood. That combination is intentional. It's how a story prepares to stop asking exploratory questions and start asking final ones. So when we talk about Act 3 for Deltarune, we shouldn't imagine as a sudden spike in spectacle or darkness. Structurally, it's more likely to be the moment when hidden alignments become visible, when secrets stop being protective and start being actual liabilities, when the story can no longer afford to keep its audience in the dark or its layers separate. By the time a story reaches its final act, forward motion stops being the point. What matters is resolution in the structural sense. The story has to account for the path it has already taken. Threads that were allowed to remain separate begin to overlap. Choices that felt provisional earlier start to harden into consequences. For Deltarune, that kind of ending carries a particular kind of pressure. This is a narrative that has made its structure visible from the beginning. Chapters are numbered. Progress is tracked. The game encourages the player to think in terms of sequence and advancement, then repeatedly complicates what advancement actually means. That framing creates expectations, and by the end, or in the final act, those expectations demand some form of reckoning. In most 3-act stories, Act 3 brings a central conflict into direct contact with the systems that have supported it. The antagonist can no longer remain abstract. Hidden influences have to surface. Information that was once withheld becomes necessary. The story narrows down, and that narrowing doesn't always look dramatic on the surface, but it is always decisive. The narrative stops offering new lanes and starts closing old ones. Deltarune appears to be arranging itself for that kind of narrowing. By Chapter 4, several key dynamics are already in place. The Knight has demonstrated a willingness to ignore pacing and disrupt the chapter format itself. Chris has begun acting with intent that excludes both the player and the rest of the party. An unseen collaborator operates through limited contact. These elements don't just exist to be mysteries in isolation. They point toward the finale built around exposure rather than escalation. A final act structured this way would not be satisfied with a straightforward confrontation alone. It would need to address authorship, control, and sequence directly, because those ideas have been woven into the experience of playing the game. The player has been trained to move forward chapter by chapter, while being quietly encouraged to question whether forward motion is the same thing as understanding. An ending that ignored that tension would feel incomplete, regardless of how spectacular its battles or reveals might be. This is where the chapter numbering itself becomes narratively unstable. Numbers imply order and progression. They suggest that meaning accumulates linearly, like a linear story. But Deltarune has already shown discomfort with that assumption. Information arrives late. Key actions happen off screen. Crucial decisions are made without the player's consent or awareness. By the time the story reaches its final stretch, the idea that everything important will appear neatly at the end feels increasingly unlikely. In a lot of 3-act stories, the final act includes a return, more than just simply nostalgia, but as a confrontation. The audience is brought back to the story's origin point with new context. Early moments are reinterpreted. The path taken is revealed as intentional rather than accidental. For a story so invested in chapters and sequences, the most natural way to stage that return would involve disrupting the sequence itself. That's where the idea of a chapter 0 becomes structurally plausible, not as a prologue placed at the beginning, but as a chapter revealed late and positioned between the final numbered chapters. Such a chapter would not exist to add backstory for its own sake. Its function would be reframing. It would ask the player to reconsider how the story began, who was involved earlier than they realized, and how much of the journey was guided before it ever felt constrained. This is why a chapter 0 is likely, but it's not the only answer here. Deltarune could resolve these tensions in other ways. What matters is that the story structure makes room for a move like this. The game has spent considerable time encouraging the player to notice what is hidden, what is deferred, and what arrives out of order. A final act that engages those ideas directly would feel consistent with the groundwork that was already laid. When you step back and look at Deltarune as a whole, at least as far as Chapter 4 allows, what stands out is not any single twist or mystery. It's the patience of the design. The story takes its time teaching the audience how to move through it, then gradually complicates what that movement means. It introduces structures early, encourages trust in that structure, and then starts placing pressure on it from multiple directions at once. Through a 3-act lens, the shape that emerges feels deliberate. Chapters 1 through 3 function as a complete opening movement. They establish the chapter format, normalize Dark World as a repeatable experience, and let the player settle into a rhythm that feels manageable. The sudden arrival of the night at the end of Chapter 3, though, breaks that rhythm decisively. From that point on, the story no longer feels like a series of contained adventures, it feels like something unfolding under observation. Chapter 4 deepens that shift rather than just resolving it. Chris's secrecy, the unseen collaborator on the phone, and the controlled access to the bunker all point in the same direction. Information is being curated. Events are being staged. The player is no longer aligned with the protagonist by default, and neither are Susie or Rouse. These are lines being drawn towards a shared point of collision. That collision is what Act 3 exists to deliver. Not a bigger spectacle, but a reckoning with the systems the story has relied on so far. Control, authorship, sequence, and choice have all been treated as flexible ideas up to this point. A final act will need to decide what they mean when flexibility runs out. That decision cannot be abstract, it has to be enacted through the story structure, because structure itself has been a part of the game from the very beginning. This is why the idea of a Chapter 0 feels worth considering, not as a prediction and not as a twist for shock value, but as a structural response to the questions that the story has raised. A chapter revealed late, placed out of numerical order, would directly engage with the game's fixation on progress and sequence. It would allow the story to return to its own beginning with the clarity that it earned by everything that came after. It would turn the act of reordering into meaning, rather than just treating meaning as something that only exists at the end. Whether or not Deltarune ultimately does this is less important than what the possibility actually tells us. The narrative has been training the player to expect understanding to arrive late, to notice what happens off-screen, and to accept that moving forward is not the same as seeing clearly. A story built on those ideas does not need to end with conquest or closure in the traditional sense. It needs to end with alignment, with the audience being finally able to see how the path was shaped, and why it felt the way it did while walking it. 3-act structure helps articulate that shape, not because Deltarune obeys it rigidly, but because the framework highlights where the story chooses to apply pressure and where it chooses to withhold release. The opening teaches, the middle destabilizes, the ending, when it comes, will have to account for both. If it does, then whatever form it takes, numbered normally or not, it will feel less like a surprise and more like recognition. And for a story so concerned with who's allowed to know what and when, that kind of ending feels earned. Once you accept that Deltarune is following a broadly classical structure, even while playing with it, theorizing about future events becomes less about guessing surprises and more about asking what work still needs to be done. 3-act stories do not simply end when the villain is defeated or the prophecy is fulfilled. They end when the questions raised in Act 1 and sharpened in Act 2 are finally forced to resolve. That gives us a useful way to think about what chapters 5, 6, and beyond may need to accomplish. By this point in the story, Act 2 is clearly underway. The Knight has appeared directly, Chris is acting with intent outside the player's knowledge, hidden collaborators and hidden spaces are no longer hypothetical. What Act 2 still needs is closure of its own. The middle act typically ends with a rupture that permanently changes how the story can function. After that moment, returning to the old format becomes literally impossible. That makes Chapter 5 structurally important in a way that goes beyond its individual plot. It likely exists to finish the pursuit phase of Act 2, and to trigger the event that breaks Deltarune's status quo for good. Several possibilities fit that requirement, and they are not mutually exclusive. One such possibility is a decisive reveal surrounding December Holiday. Whether that takes the form of her identity being directly tied to the night, or a deeper clarity about what happened to her, or even a confirmation of responsibility for whatever it is that happened to her, a death-focused revelation would reframe much of what the story has been circling emotionally. Noelle's arc, which has quietly tracked grief, denial, and escapism from the beginning, feels positioned for a catalytic moment. Act 2 endings often hinge on a personal loss or realization that makes the abstract conflict unavoidable. Learning the truth about death, especially if it shatters Noelle's remaining hope, would fit that role cleanly. Another likely pressure point is Noelle herself. A 3-act structure strongly suggests that if a character has been positioned near a dangerous power for long enough, the story will eventually force a moment where that power is used under emotional strain. Noelle creating a dark fountain, whether in desperation, grief, or even misguided hope, would be a natural escalation of themes already in play. It would also collapse the distance between victim and agent. The bunker represents a different kind of rupture. It has been present for far too long, and too deliberately flamed to remain sealed indefinitely. Opening it near the end of Act 2 would follow a familiar structural rhythm. Hidden knowledge becomes unavoidable. Contained danger spills outwards. Whether the bunker holds Gaster, a supercharged fountain, or something even weirder and stranger, its opening would likely function as the point of no return. The story could no longer pretend that dark worlds are local phenomena or manageable problems. Any one of these events could serve as Act 2's breaking point. Several of these happening in rapid succession would make even more sense. A death reveal leading to Noelle's actions, triggering the bunker opening, resulting in the roaring, would create a chain reaction that permanently alters the narrative landscape. After that, Act 3 begins because there is no longer a world left where Act 1 rules apply. That brings us to Chapter 6. Structurally, Chapter 6 occupies a strange but telling position. It's the first chapter after the originally intended Act 2 release grouping. That alone suggests it was conceived under different assumptions. In 3-act stories, the first chapter of Act 3 often feels disorienting. The world is different, familiar anchors are gone, the characters are reacting to consequences rather than choosing paths. That makes the ideas like the absence of the light world, post-warring gameplay, or even extended time inside the bunker feel plausible rather than extreme. Act 3 frequently strips away the comfort of normalcy so the story can focus entirely on resolution. If Dark Worlds were once escapes, then Act 3 would demand confrontation. If the prophecy promised here is at the world's end, then this is where that promise would finally be tested. There is also a strong structural reason to suspect that Chapter 6 contains what most players would identify as the ending. Not the credits necessarily, but the fulfillment of the prophecy. 3 heroes, the world's edge, 1 ending. Deltarune has repeatedly suggested that this ending exists and cannot be altered. That framing fits cleanly with the idea that Chapter 6 resolves the central conflict of the story as it has been presented. Which raises an important problem. Stories that stop at prophecy fulfillment tend to feel incomplete when they spent so much time questioning authorship, control, and meaning. And Deltarune has been, unusually explicit about this discomfort, and tells us that there's one ending, then immediately undermines the idea that reaching it is what matters most. That tension strongly implies that something comes after. And this is where Chapter 0 enters the theory, as a structural necessity. A Chapter 0, placed between Chapters 6 and 7, or unlocked after 6 before the final chapter, would serve a specific role. It would provide origin at the moment origin became unavoidable. A chapter focused on December Holiday, potentially even playable, potentially even depicting earlier Dark World adventures with Azrael and Sham, would not exist to add just lore trivia. Its function would be to reframe everything. It would show that the story did not begin where the player thought it did, and that forces a re-evaluation of agency, responsibility, and inevitability right at the moment when the story seems finished. In 3-act terms, this is a delayed recognition beat. The audience learns what was really at stake only after the main conflict is already resolved. That kind of placement only works at the end because only then does the full weight of the information actually land. Which leaves Chapter 7. If Chapter 6 is where the prophecy resolves, then Chapter 7 almost has to exist outside that resolution. Structurally, it fills a role that most 3-act stories leave implicit. It answers the question of what remains once inevitability has finished asserting itself. By this point, the story has already told us what it's willing to lock in place. 1 ending. 3 heroes at the world's edge. Blah, blah, blah. a conclusion that cannot be avoided or rewritten from inside the system that produced it. If Deltarune stopped there, it would be coherent. It would also contradict much of what the story has spent its time emphasizing, though. Again and again, the game draws a distinction between endings and continuation, progress and authorship, fate and choice, not within the story's events, but around them. The structure keeps insisting that there is a difference between how a story ends and what comes after a story ends. That is what Chapter 7 feels positioned to explore. Rather than escalating conflict further, a final chapter like this would exist in an aftermath, a changed world, a reset world, a world that survived through stranger means, perhaps through Sans' machine, or maybe through something stranger and more abstract. But the specifics matter less than the function. This chapter would not be about winning, it would be about inheritance. In that sense, Chapter 7 does not belong cleanly to the same narrative arc as the chapters before it. It belongs to whoever is left once the arc is complete, the next generation, the people who were not meant to save the world, but to live in whatever remains of it, the ones who pick up the pen. That idea is not something we're projecting onto the game from the outside. It's already there, spelled out directly in front of us, in one of the most looked-at conversations in Deltarune, and it feels appropriate to let that scene close the discussion because it says more clearly than any other theory ever could. So instead of summarizing it, it's worth ending by hearing it in full. If Deltarune truly has one ending, then this conversation tells us what that ending is not meant to be. It is not the final word. It is not the final act of authorship. It's a stopping point, after which responsibility changes hands. Gerson himself said that after Chapter 5, he only had one more chapter to write. Yet, we are seemingly going to get 7 chapters in Deltarune. This is pretty blatantly telling us we're going to go beyond whatever the ending that's coming is. Read through a 3-act lens, the story's shape begins to feel less like a closed loop and more like a relay. Act 1 teaches the language. Act 2 exposes the cost of using it. Act 3 finishes that sentence. What comes after is not about changing the ending, it's about deciding what happens to those that read it. If that is where Deltarune is headed, then a Chapter 0, a Chapter 7, or anything else that exists beyond the prophecy is just as guaranteed as the prophecy itself, and seemingly more important. If the game ends by asking the player to think less about how stories conclude, and more about how stories continue through the effects they have on people, then the structure was telling us that all along. Thank you for watching.